Okay. The capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production constitutes precisely this causal nucleus of the totality of capitalist power relations. And what Marx analyzed in Capital was exactly the capitalist mode of production, this causal nucleus, not Britain of the 19th century. So the capitalist mode of production is established in the capital relation initially on the level of production, that is, in the separation of the worker from the means of production, who is thus transformed the worker into a wage laborer, possessor only of his or her labor power, and in the full ownership of the production means by the capitalist. Simultaneously, capitalism as a social system implies the formation of a specific state form and specific forms of concealment of class domination, that is, the ruling ideology. As Marx writes, it is in its case the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the immediate producers, in which we find the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social edifice, and hence also the political form of the relationship of sovereignty and dependence. This is very characteristic. Specific societies, however, consist of a mosaic of social class relations which do not all belong to the same time of social coherence, the same time of class power. Because if we speak broadly and historically, they constitute the specific result of the evolution of a society, which may allow the survival of elements with roots to previous types of social organization, that is, to previous historical system of class power, for example, feudalism. The articulation of the different modes of production is always contradictory, and is accomplished under the domination of one particular mode of production. If this mode of production is the capitalist mode of production, we have the tendency towards the dissolution of all antagonistic modes of production. Not every mode of production, but the antagonistic ones, that is, those modes of production which consist of different and opposing system of class exploitation. In most cases, this dissolution of pre-capitalist modes of production took the form of agricultural or a land reform, precisely since it involved modes of production that were mainly based on pre-capitalist property relations in the land. But now let us focus on the contemporary advanced capitalist societies, in most of which, or in all of which, pre-capitalist modes of production have been swept away. However, besides the capitalist mode of production, other non-capitalist forms and modes of production are being reproduced all the time. Case one, first of all, the self-employment as a form of production, that is, self-employed merchants, artisans, peasants, scientists, and so on. This form of production is defined in Marxist literature as the traditional petty bourgeoisie. In this case, we have simple commodity production and not capitalist production. In other words, production of commodities that do not include profit, but only the remuneration of the direct producer. We have an interesting analysis by Marx. This is in theories of surplus value. Independent producers who employ no laborers and therefore do not produce as capitalists are producers of commodities, not sellers of labor. Their production does not fall under the capitalist mode of production. The predominance of the capitalist mode of production implies that these independent simple commodity producers must produce within competitive conditions for the markets as owners of the production means. As Marx writes, the only absolute barrier he faces, this independent producer, is the wage that he pays himself after deducting his actual expenses. And he often does so down to a physical minimum. Production proceeds without being governed by the general rate of profit. This means that in opposition to the capitalist production, the volume of or the value of the means of production that this independent producer uses does not have to yield at least the minimum profit rates. It yields only something that is more or less equivalent to a laborer's wage. So this is the first case, the independent producer, the simple commodity production. But we have a second case, which is the case of the small entrepreneur. Marx argues that not every entrepreneur or owner of the means of production who hires wage laborers shall be regarded as capitalist. For the owner of the means of production to be capital, the scale of production and the number of wage earners employed by the entrepreneur must be such that the capitalist is disengaged from actual labor and thereby focused on the supervision direction of the production process. The capitalist's income, that is profit, depends on the magnitude of the capital advanced of the capitalist. This precondition differentiates the capitalist from the class of small entrepreneurs who employ wage labor aiming at a sizable income and whom we refer to as middle bourgeoisie. Marx writes, capitalist production only really begins when its individual capital simultaneously employs a comparatively large number of workers. A certain stage of capitalist production necessitates that the capitalist be able to devote the whole of the time during which he functions as a capitalist, that is, as capital personified, to the appropriation and therefore the control of the labor of others and to the sale of the products of that labor. That is, the capitalist does not perform the actual work of, let's say, of painting or of anything else that we can imagine. So in accordance with the above citation by Marx, it can be argued that on the economic level, the mode of production can be comprehended as an ensemble of three different relations to the means of production. That is, use, possession, and ownership of the means of production. The use of the means of production is defined as the exclusive performance of actual labor with a view to producing use values. In all modes of production, the use relation lies in the hands of the direct producers. The possession of the means of production refers to the management of the production process, namely the power to put the means of production into operation. And the ownership of as an economic relationship is the control over the means of production in the sense of having the power to dispose of the surplus obtained. In every mode of production, the ownership relation lies in the hands of the ruling class. Excuse me. So in the capitalist mode of production, both ownership, that is the power to obtain the surplus value, and possession of the means of production, that is the management of the production process, coexist in the hands of the ruling capitalist class. In other words, there is homology of ownership and possession by the capitalist. And of course, the capitalist and the working class are the fundamental classes of all societies, of all capitalist societies. So, all the above means that an entrepreneur must be disentangled from the use of the means of production in order to become capitalist. That is, leave the use of production to the direct producers. The capitalist is, of course, directly present in the enterprise as the top manager who holds the possession of the means of production in the production process, personifying the enterprise as such. The same top manager shares the ownership of the means of production with the money capitalist who personifies the financial form of existence of the enterprise. And maybe you remember this scheme from previous discussions that we have. The production process, which is in the brackets, money advanced, which becomes capital, that is labor power and means of production, then the production process per se, and output, which when sold brings more money, is connected with the financial sphere, as this money comes from the shareholder and the bondholder, the money capitalist, who together with the manager or functioning capitalist, as Marx names him or her in the third volume of Capital, is the place of capital, that is the capitalist class. As we had discussed in the past, capital takes on a Janus-faced existence as both a means of production and as financial securities, as we have discussed in the past. It shall be noted at this point parenthetically that by contrast to the capitalist mode of production, non-homology of ownership and possession of the means of production was characteristic in pre-capitalist modes of production. For example, feudalism, the Asiatic mode of production, slavery, and so on. As possession of the means of production remained in the hands of direct laborers, extra economic coercion, a relation of servitude or bond service, was rendered necessary for safeguarding the appropriation of the surplus product by the owner of the means of production. In contrast, in capitalism, homology of ownership and possession of the means of production connotes that free, in quotation marks, laborers work for the benefit of the owner's class without extra economic coercion. The economic structure of society becomes predominant. Let us return, however, to contemporary advanced capital societies, which lack pre-capitalist modes of production. The following points can be concluded so far. First, the capitalist possesses both the ownership and the possession of the means of production, but not their use. She or he has both the power to place into operation the means of production, as well the power to acquire the final surplus value. The working class holds the user relation, the ability to perform of actual labor. Second, social groups that are not carriers of this fundamental capital-labor relation are defined as non-fundamental or middle social classes. Small entrepreneurs who exploit a marginal number of salaried laborers and perform similar activities as laborers in the production process are entangled in the user relation and do not therefore belong to the capitalist class. They constitute an intermediate social class, the middle bourgeoisie, pertaining to what may be named the hybrid mode of production, which is not simple commodity production, but also not capitalist production. It's something in between. That's why hybrid mode of production. The laborers of this hybrid mode of production may be designated as the spurious working class. Second, self-employment is also related to the unity of the ownership and possession with the use relation in one class carrier. Consequently, within capitalism, we find another historically peculiar non-capitalist form of production, the simple commodity production. In this commodity production, simple commodity production, one social class is defined, the traditional petty bourgeoisie. And following some authors like Nikos Poulantzos and others, we may call it this simple commodity production a form and not a mode of production, in as much as its production process does not entail surplus product appropriation. Of course, and this point is very important, the hybrid mode of production and simple commodity production constitute production forms and processes which are non-antagonistic to the capitalist mode of production. They have a very, let's say, a smooth interconnection with the capitalist mode of production, despite the fact that there are, of course, tensions, and in some cases, these modes of production are pushed away by the capitalist mode of production, but they are at the same time reproduced in the same or in other branches of the economy. They never cease to exist. Having said all the above, we can now turn to a third middle class, the so-called new petty bourgeoisie, which is formed on the one hand inside the capitalist enterprise and on the other in state apparatuses. So, as Marx writes in Capital, Volume 1, with the emergence of the capitalist enterprise, the real level of the overall labor process is increasingly not the individual worker, but the collective worker, formed out of the combination of a number of individual workers. The one who produces is not the isolated worker, the one or the other, but all together as they form the collective worker within the capitalist enterprise. The question which is now posited is the following: is this collective worker, that is capitalistically hired labor, identified with the working class? According to Marx in volume 1 of Capital, within this collective worker, we have, which is like an industrial army, like a real, it is an industrial army like a real army. There are officers, that is managers and NCOs, foremen, overseers, of a special kind of wage laborers, whose exclusive function is the work of manager supervision as opposed to the performance of actual manual work. We speak here also about engineers, technicians, economic cadres in the enterprise and so on. Consequently, wage earners belonging to this special category of wage labor do not exclusively perform the function of labor, user relation, but on the contrary, exercise powers of capital. That is, there are functions of capital which are entrusted to these special categories of laborers within the big capitalist enterprise. So although they are productive workers exploited by capital, that is, they produce, they are part of the collective work and take part in the production of value and surplus value, they also at the same time function as capital. They undertake supervisory functions in the name of the capitalist class, or the reproduction of the production process. That is, despite the subjection to capitalist exploitation, they are not elements of the working class. They are part of an intermediate social class situated between the capitalist and the working class. And it's named in Marxist literature the new petty bourgeoisie. Engineers, technicians, technologists belong to this class, performing specific forms of management and supervision, labor which emanates from the capitalist division between science and experience, between skilled and non-skilled labor, and so on. Of course, this new petty bourgeoisie is also characterized by an internal hierarchy. However, as a whole, it is clearly differentiated from the working class, as it is the conveyor belt of capital's will in the workplace. A special case is in enterprises where the actual, for example, technological enterprises, where the actual labor is performed by engineers or other scientists. In this case, we have a process of proletarianization of intellectual labor, as it is described. But in the general case, they are the conveyor belts of capital's will. And so a different class, both from the capitalist class and the working class. This part of the petty bourgeoisie is, of course, situated in the capitalist production process as such. Following Nikos Poulantzas's work, we maintain, however, that the new petty bourgeoisie also comprises all those wage earners who staff the apparatuses of the capital state and so exercise powers in the name of the capitalist system in the process of its overall social reproduction. That is, wage earners who are not productive in the sense that they do not exchange their labor force with capital, because they work for the state, not for an enterprise, not for capitalist production. But the capitalist state is, of course, a very important element in the overall capitalist relations of power. The question posed at this point is why different social groups belong to the same social class, despite the fact that they undertake different roles in the capitalist division of labor. On the one hand, capitalist production, on the other, state apparatuses. The answer is that these groups exercise the same type of social functions within capitalist production and social reproduction as a whole process, despite being active in different social areas. That is, there is a structural interaction that unites their social functions. On the one hand, the domination of the economic structure in the capitalist mode of production, in the last instance, determines the functions of the superstructure, the state. And on the other hand, this superstructure overdetermines capitalist economic domination. That is, it harmonizes the economic level with the needs of the overall capitalist reproduction. The state plays a central organizational role, representing and organizing the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie class, politically unifying its various fractions, all of which occupied positions in the terrain of domination over the ruled, exploited classes of society. Thus, it is through this interaction that these different social groups find their common class place within capitalism. Their functions converge at the capitalist power reproduction level. So, as a partial conclusion, the new petty bourgeoisie is the middle social class of capitalism that combines wage earners who are not part of the working class, precisely due to their role in the exercise of capitalist powers. Parallel to this, these wage earners are not part of the capitalist class, since they are not owners of the means of production. Often, that is the case of the one section of this new petty bourgeoisie, being subjected to capitalist exploitation. They exercise the following functions. First, functions that ensure the extraction of surplus value, such as supervision, overseeing, control of the production process, technicians, engineers, etc. Second, functions that ensure the cohesion of capitalist political power, state bureaucracy, the judicial apparatus, the military, and so on, and the systematization and dissemination of the ruling ideology, as for example, education. The new petty bourgeoisie includes, therefore, both productive wage earners, those who exchange their labor for capital and produce surplus value, category 1, and non-productive wage earners, that is, those who are employed in the public non-entrepreneurial sector and do not produce surplus value, category 2. And now we can tackle our final issue, which is related with the political stances of these middle classes in different conjunctures. That is, in the framework of class struggle, which, as we have already discussed, is the motive force of history. What is common in Marxist literature and discussions is that, in general, we must distinguish between the class places, that is, the structural element of a class, the relation of the class with the user relation, the possession relation, and the ownership relation, and the ideological political class positions, places versus positions, the latter of which refer to the stance of a class at a specific conjuncture, at a concrete situation of class struggle within a society. A link between class place and class position can be achieved provided that class instinct, that is the propensity of the class which corresponds to class place, is transformed into class consciousness, corresponding to the interests of a class. Although class places may potentially indicate class positions, the opposite is not valid. Class positions cannot indicate class places. So, for an example of this analysis comes again from Nikos Poulantzas. A social class may take up a class position that does not correspond to its interests. Okay. I remind you at this point that we detected three intermediate or middle classes in contemporary advanced capitalist societies: the traditional petty bourgeoisie of self-employed simple commodity producers, the new petty bourgeoisie of wage earners which exercise powers in the name of the capitalist system within the process of capitalist production and social reproduction, the latter related to the capitalist state. And third, the middle bourgeoisie of small self-employed entrepreneurs formed within the hybrid mode of production who exploit a marginal number of salaried labor force. So, focusing now on the potential political stances of classes in a capitalist society, we will see that each middle class sub-collectivity is characterized by different political tendencies, many of which correspond to the peculiarities of the structural features of each class. A first demarcation line is shaped in relation to the capitalist strategy of austerity, market liberalization, and privatizations, that is, neoliberalism, which dominated advanced capitalist societies during the recent decades. The main point here is that the living standard of labor, of wage labor, is the labor cost of capitalists. That is a contradiction which cannot be compromised. And this line polarizes on the one side the bourgeoisie as a class strategy expressed by the capitalist state also, and on the other, the working class. However, this polarization does not mean that the working class primarily tends towards anti-capitalism. There are other factors, political organizations and so on, revolutionary parties that may allow this situation. In the general case, it develops a propensity, the working class, I mean, towards reformism in an effort to preserve their income levels and labor rights, especially as a large part of the working class faces or faced in many cases the risk of unemployment. The second demarcation line arises from the capitalist strategy of privatizations of public services that is the dismantling of the welfare state, and public enterprises, and creates a tendency towards confrontation of the majority of state employees with the capitalist neoliberal agenda. The already mentioned tensions, the above tensions, favor the polarization of the majority of the new petty bourgeoisie to the side of the labor reformist social camp, whereas the middle bourgeoisie of small-scale entrepreneurship approaches the capitalist strategy of austerity, that is the strategy of reducing labor costs. The traditional petty bourgeoisie of self-employment seems rather to be divided between these two positions. On the one hand, building a social continuum, albeit with significant contradictions with the middle bourgeoisie, and on the other, joining the struggles for a solidary pension system and against further cuts in popular incomes along with the realm of wage labor. As in the case of the middle bourgeoisie, it is a class external to the large enterprise and the state, as opposed to the new petty bourgeoisie who staffs state apparatuses and large companies. So, talking about class places, first of all, we have the three modes of production, that is the hybrids, the simple commodity mode of production, and the petty bourgeoisie, which is within the capitalist mode of production as the overseers and engineers and managers and so on, and non-economic level, which is the state. The middle bourgeoisie has a homology of ownership and possession of the means of production, as well as the simple commodity producers, that is the traditional petty bourgeoisie, not the new petty bourgeoisie. The use relation belongs partially, along with the workers, to the middle bourgeoisie. It belongs to the simple commodity producers, of course, but not to the new petty bourgeoisie. And of course, the two first classes, that is middle bourgeoisie and traditional petty bourgeoisie, are external, have an external relationship with the capitalist enterprise and the capitalist state, whereas in contradiction to the above, the class of the new petty bourgeoisie has an internal relation, staffs the state and the capitalist enterprise. So, throughout recent history, it has repeatedly been demonstrated that in phases of economic crisis, that is the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial meltdown, the corona crisis and so on, and in phases of destabilization of parliamentary relationship of representation, small entrepreneurship, and certain marginalized strata, but also some part of the traditional petty bourgeoisie are attracted to the ultra-nationalist and far-right movements. This support for the far right could be interpreted by the specific elements of common character of an anti-capitalism within capitalism, in quotation marks, that is against plutocrats but within and inside capitalism, that are shared by the middle bourgeoisie and the traditional petty bourgeoisie in relation to the anti-plutocratic, in quotation marks, declarations of the far right against plutocrats and large capitalist companies, which constitute a potential threat to their survival as classes that owns means of production, but also against redistribution of wealth, that is, a rise in labor costs, therefore in favor of wage austerity, since it is a class of small employers or potential small employers, as in the case of some sections of the traditional petty bourgeoisie. From this aspect, a large part of the entrepreneurial world, that is, entrepreneurial middle classes, approach the capitalist class interests. The same is valid for the top ranks of the new petty bourgeoisie, who function as trustworthy managers of the social order, but also for those who staff the core repressive apparatuses of the state, police, secret services, etc. So we have the potential anti-capitalist positions. When I write anti-capitalist in quotation marks, I mean anti-capitalist within capitalism. Opposition to big companies, yes, for the middle bourgeoisie and the traditional petty bourgeoisie. No, for the new petty bourgeoisie, who are cadres of these enterprises. Opposition to private property, no to middle bourgeoisie and traditional petty bourgeoisie, possibly in the case of new petty bourgeoisie. Redistribution of wealth, no for the middle bourgeoisie, because this means lower income for the owner, less profit, possibly for the traditional petty bourgeoisie, because these self-employed are sometimes favored by the rise of wages and so on, or pensions, and yes, for the new petty bourgeoisie. Also, the issue of the aspirations of upward social mobility. Upward social mobility through profit, yes, possibly for the middle bourgeoisie, because a middle bourgeoisie enterprise may become a capitalist enterprise. No for the traditional petty bourgeoisie, as far as it remains in this position, and no for the new petty bourgeoisie. Upward social mobility through professional uplift, no for the two entrepreneurial middle classes, yes for the new petty bourgeoisie, who can improve their position in the enterprise. And of course, political polarization, right-wing extremist movements, yes, for some parts of the middle bourgeoisie in special conjunctures and the traditional petty bourgeoisie, no for the wage earners of the state and the capitalist enterprises in their majority. Of course, it's different if we speak for special branches as, for example, police or special police forces and so on. Reformist movements, no for the middle bourgeoisie, possibly for the traditional, and yes, for the majority of the new petty bourgeoisie. Autonomous class strategy, no, we cannot have a society of small entrepreneurs or of self-employed producers, possibly for the new petty bourgeoisie, in as much as some of them can become higher managers, top managers, or even be inspired by some regimes that are based on state property. So, concluding my whole analysis and leaving aside possible isolated cases or exceptions, I may say that while a class alliance between the working class and the majority of the new petty bourgeoisie seems likely in many cases, and alliances with the traditional petty bourgeoisie seems more arduous, while an alliance of the working class with the middle bourgeoisie appears to be rather unlikely. Thank you very much. That was it.
John, thank you very much. I will just call attention to the chat, and if you have questions or comments, you could type the word stack in the space to add yourself to the stack of speakers, or you can just use the raise hand function, as I see Michael is already doing. And if you prefer not to speak, you can of course type your question or comment here, and John will respond. John, I suggest we take 2 or 3 in a row, and then give you back the floor to
okay, yes, of course.
So let's start with Michael. And John, you may want to turn off your screen share at this point.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Hello, I would like to thank Dr. Milios for his presentation. Without supporting his main thesis and ideas, in general of his work, I would like to make a comment about Poulanza's analysis. In Fascism and Dictatorship, in his work in the late 70s, if I remember correctly, Poulanzas states that the cornerstone or philosopher's stone of the Marxist analysis is the analysis of the petty bourgeoisie. And I would like you to make a comment on this and elaborate a further bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Just this question. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, anyone else at this point? I have 3 kind of related questions that to pose to John. One is, I wonder if you would be able to perhaps concretize your presentation in discussing this case of Greece in the last decade or so. Mm-hmm. Certainly there's been a great deal of class struggle and a great deal of composition and recomposition of working and middle classes as a result of the crisis, and then later as a result of the political crisis under Syriza. So I think that would be interesting to bring your work into a concrete case. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, but less importantly, I'm wondering about how we would position the staff of nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that are somewhat state-like oftentimes, but kind of apart from the productive apparatus of capital, but to serve certain functions within capital. And then finally, just I see that you refer to the new middle classes or the new petty bourgeoisie, and I'm wondering how that relates to the theories of the professional managerial class that the Ehrenreichs and others have discussed. So those are my 3 questions. Anyone else at this point? Okay, John, over to you for Michael and my questions.
Okay. First, the question of Michael. Yes, this is a very interesting point of Poulandra's. The book was published in 1970, I think, in French, the first edition, and we have the translations later in the same decade. Of course, there are some problems with the analysis of, according to my view and the view of George Economakis, with whom we have worked together on the analysis of the Marxist analysis of social classes, which have certain differences with Poulandra's analysis. For example, the way Poulandra's understands productive labor. He excludes the new petty bourgeoisie from productive labor. He excludes the larger part of services, although they are capitalistic enterprises. And he does not identify the middle bourgeoisie as a separate class from the traditional petty bourgeoisie. Apart from this, his work is very crucial for conceptualizing capitalism, and also in the book that you mentioned, for conceptualizing the far-right movements and also the strategies of the left in the specific case, the strategy of the Third International against fascism before Hitler came to power. So it's a very valuable work. It's very correct that he stresses the middle class issue or petty bourgeoisie issue. But what I have presented is not, it's somehow inspired by this work, but it's not a Poulandzian approach per se. There are many differences. Now, let's come to the questions of David. Yes, Greece is a very characteristic and very important case, or at least it was. By the way, we have a paper which is available on my website also, that was published. It's a co-authored paper with Economakis. It was published in a journal 2 years ago, and refers to the Greek crisis and the social struggle and the role of the middle classes in this period. The most important period was the period 2010 to 2012. The crisis came in Greece in 2010. It was a crisis imposed by the policies of the ruling class. The sovereign debt, the public debt of Greece, was something above 100% of the GDP in 2007, and when the financial meltdown started, it jumped to 126. 126% of the GDP is not high compared to what the respective number for the United States, Italy, Japan, or Greece are now. Staying in the case of Greece, it's now above 200%. At that time, the European Central Bank, which is the central bank of all euro area countries, refused to finance the state bonds of the to buy and support the bonds of the euro area. As a result, the interest rates surged in the capital markets, and certain countries, that is Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Cyprus, could not support their debtors by the regular means, that is by being financed by the markets. So the European authorities created a new scheme which financed these countries outside of the markets. This scheme was based on the European countries, the ECB, and the International Monetary Fund, under certain conditions, under certain memoranda. The conditions were, simply speaking, a very extreme redistribution of income, wealth, and social power from below to above. That is, cutting wages, dismantling the welfare state, privatizing nearly everything, liberalizing all markets, and so on. In order to understand what happened now, there was a propaganda that the main motto was that we consume more than we produce. And this was due to the fact that the sovereign debt of Greece jumped from 100% to 126%. And this meant that we consume more than we can produce, and that's why the good institutions, that is the IMF, the ECB, and the European Union, financed the Greek debt. When the coronavirus crisis erupted, the policy was different. The ECB supported the sovereign debt of each and every member of the euro area. The result is that with a sovereign debt of 210%, the interest rate, the real interest rates, that is interest rates minus inflation, are very negative. At that time that we speak, the time that we speak now, the interest rates of the Greek sovereign debt are something between 3 and 4%, and the inflation is, the interest rates of the 10-year bonds of the Greek state, and the inflation rate is 11%. That is, the markets borrow the Greek state with a negative interest rate of more than -7%, of course, forecasting the future and so on. Why? Because the European Central Bank guarantees the Greek sovereign debt as exactly as it guarantees the sovereign debt of other countries, and nobody speaks anymore about consuming more than producing and other such nonsense. During that time, the people, a large part of the people, the working class and others in Greece, realized that the problem was not simply the economic crisis, and the economic crisis was not the fault of the lazy Greeks or the lazy Italians or the lazy Irish and so on. But there was a conflict inside the country or between the leading authorities of the European Union and the majority of the people, and so there were very large movements. The trade unions organized very big rallies, but also we had this square movements. That is, in all big cities, as in Spain, in Greece, as in Spain, there were enormous gatherings of people in the main squares of the cities, for example, in the Constitution or Syntagma Square in Athens, where people discussed, organized discussions, and demanded different policies. This resulted in the fall of three governments. First, the government of George Papandreou, who introduced the austerity measures and made the first deals with the IMF, a government of the Socialist Party, PASOK, then a government of a banker, and so on. And the top of this movement, of this enormous movement, was during the years 2010 to 2012. The result was a full reshuffling of the central political scene, that is, of the parliamentary strength of parties. A small party of around 5%, Syriza, the name is Coalition of the Radical Left, which was actually a coalition of the former Euro Communist Party, Communist Party inland, with certain groups and parties of the non-parliamentary left, that is the far left parties, became major opposition, that is second party. But both parties, that is the first party, the New Democracy, the Conservative Party, and the Syriza Party, which became major opposition, barely together surpassed the limit of 50% of the voters. There was a great reshuffling. In the period that followed until 2015, January of 2015, the movement was becoming constantly more moderate, because the people who were part of this movement or movements thought that the parliamentary solution will be able to tackle all the problems. In the meantime, in the period between 2012 and 2015, the leadership of Syriza had made its deals with the ruling authorities and institutions, and also economic agents, big corporations, and so on in Greece. And finally, we came to a situation where in February, at the end of January 2015, Syriza won the elections, and on the 20th of February signed a treaty or an agreement with the Troika, that is the IMF, the ECB, and the European Union, practically of continuing the same policy. This agreement was signed by the Minister of Finance Yanis Varoufakis, and in the following months there were negotiations, but all negotiations were in the framework of continuing the same policy. Then, according to my opinion and to the opinion of others, the Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras thought that he could make a hat trick and come out of the difficult situation before signing the final agreement of continuing the same policy. And this hat trick was to call for a memorandum on accepting or not accepting the propositions of the Troika. I say that it was a hat trick because the parliamentary strength of Syriza was around 36%. And of course, it was the only party that was in favor of no. All other parties, the Socialist Party, the Conservative, other center parties, and so on, were in favor of yes, to accept the propositions of the Troika. Also, all esteemed, let's say, institutions, for example, the Lawyers' Bar of Athens, of Thessaloniki, of other cities, the Association of Greek Engineers, the university professors, all these esteemed organizations and trade unions of the upper middle classes, let's say, were in favor of yes. So, according to my opinion, Tsipras thought that if we achieved to have 50 or 51 or 49%, it would be a victory for our party. And another issue is that the Communist Party of Greece had the opinion not to participate in the referendum. So they were not in favor of no. Syriza was the only party who supported no officially. Of course, the people of the Communist Party, as it can be concluded from the result, voted for no, but the leadership was not to take part. And the result was more than 61% in favor of no. And so the hat trick failed because it was a clear victory of no. It was not something like 50-50, and then the Prime Minister would say, I cannot divide the country, or you decided with 50.5% in favor of yes, or anything like that. And the next day, after this glorious victory of no, where the working class, the poor people were really enthusiastic, you could see it in the cities everywhere. The demonstration in favor of no was the biggest demonstration that I have ever seen. At some times, I thought that there was danger for an accident because there were masses of people coming out of the underground, and old people, pensioners, shouting the slogan, "You vagabonds," journalists, because all the newspapers were, except of the newspaper of Syriza, were writing that there will be a full disaster of the country if the people vote for no, that all the banks will and all the enterprises will close down, that there was not going to be any petroleum or I don't know what, every day the same thing, as the same story as news, breaking news, or I don't know what. And however, 61% of the people voted for no. And the next day, the prime minister called the other parties, that is the national board, or how they say it, something that is called only in exceptional cases of so-called national problems or issues, and announced that he will continue with an agreement with the Troika, what he also did. It's interesting to think that this shift of the political leadership, or the supposed political leadership of the big movements of the period 2010-2012, 2 years of continuous demonstrations and clashes with the police and occupations of buildings and everything possible, a very important movement, that when the supposed leadership of all these movements, which was Syriza, shifted in another direction, everything seemed to disappear. This is, according to my opinion, a very important finding or issue which must be studied. That is, there was not a new leadership or a new initiative from below which would continue or would allow this movement to go on. A large part of the leadership of Syriza, around, let's say, 30% or something like that, including members of parliament and so on, left the party when the shift took place. But they couldn't express or represent what had existed before and didn't exist anymore. That is, this very big movements. What I told you is far below what is written in this paper that I mentioned before, which you can, I can send it to you if you are interested, because the paper focuses more on the rates of unemployment, so on branches of the economy which are more hit by the crisis and so on redistribution of wealth, on the level of wages and so on. And of course, it hit also the middle classes, the new bourgeoisie, clearly took a stance in favor of the movements, because it was also hit very, very hard. I can tell you only my personal example. I had a salary of around $3,500 a month, but not 14, not 12, 14 salaries of around $3,500 each. 14. Now I after the crisis, I had 1,900. That is a reduction of more than 1/3. What was more catastrophic was the fall of pensions. Pensions were cut down by more than 60%, especially in those professions that had high pensions. So it was a situation which made clear the alliance of the poor, of the working class, and of the majority of the new petty bourgeoisie. Of course, you can describe the new petty bourgeoisie as the professional class, but you have to take also other considerations. One line of interest investigation, I mean, is the role of this class in the case of regimes like of the past, but maybe of present-day regimes. But let's speak about the past, the so-called Arabian or Middle East socialism. I mean, Nasser in Egypt and so on, was a semi state capitalist regime based to a large extent on the educated new petty bourgeoisie. So this example and other examples show that the petty bourgeoisie can have inspirations of another social form or another form of society, which is not the case, of course, for the middle bourgeoisie or for the self-employed traditional petty bourgeoisie. I'm afraid I spoke too much, but yes, okay.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks a lot. We have a couple of questions in the chat from Sean and Steve Lee. Sean, would you like to speak, or should we just work from the chat?
Let me...
John, you're able to see those?
Not at the moment. Okay. Chat. No, I'm afraid I cannot see them.
Okay. Sean asks just a kind of several related questions. Where does the pensioner, the individual who lives off receipts from market investments or real estate holdings, fit into this analysis? What about the growth of the rentier class as described by Michael Hudson? What about the growth of a surplus labor class increasingly incarcerated or homeless? How are the interests of the working class to be defined? Are the labor bureaucrats in the AFL-CIO, which is the major US trade union confederation, how are labor bureaucrats to be considered a petty bourgeois group or something else? So that's Sean's questions. Maybe you can take one or two or all of those if you'd like. We have about a half hour left for the conversation.
Yes. There are special categories of people who must be regarded in relation, let's say, to the family. For example, the youth are the children of worker class people belonging to the working class. I would say yes. A similar issue may be that of the pensioner. That is, depending on the level of the pension and the profession that was before, we can see several stratifications. In the case of Europe, Germany, Greece, and other countries after the crisis, where we have a very abrupt reduction of pensions, and we have situations where people are forced to live with $800 or $900 dollars a month, or euros a month, 600 or 700 euros a month. In this case, we can see the pensioners as a category closely related to the working class or the poor petty bourgeoisie. We can bring into the analysis some more vague but useful categories like the poor, the unemployed, to some extent belong to this category. We can think about the lowest strata of the public sectors, that is cleaners or workers. They are not workers in the sense of being exploited by capital because they are employees of the state, but they belong to this poor stratification, to this poor strata, which are very close to the working class. Now, labor bureaucracy may be described as a labor aristocracy in the tradition of Lenin and the others at the beginning of the 19th century, before the Russian Revolution, where they described the labor aristocracy as the leading force of reformism in a conjuncture of European or world revolution, when we had the revolution in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, beside the Russian Revolution, and we had these parties, which the social democratic parties, which were revolutionary before the First World War, and then followed a different course, and Lenin and others introduced this notion of the labor aristocracy as a specific strata, upper strata of the labor class, which, however, takes stances that are closer to the bourgeoisie in crucial conjunctures and not to the revolutionary process. So these very fruitful questions show that there are many open issues for further research. When we talk about classes, things are much more complicated than one may think from first sight. And of course, what I try to stress is that we shall not restrain ourselves to the capital labor conflict, which of course is the major conflict in advanced capitalist societies, but we have always to take the other classes into consideration, especially if we want to deal with the conjuncture, with the political stances, with the perspective of change in society, of revolution, and so on.
Okay, we also have a question from Steve. Isn't the inclusion of teachers and so on into the new petty bourgeoisie too broad? aren't there sectors of non-productive wage workers who are directly analogous to productive wage workers? That is, they provide services needed to keep capitalist production going. Teachers, nurses, and so on in these have recently been the most militant union workers in many countries, especially in the United States. Want to respond to that?
I agree that teachers and other categories of the new petty bourgeoisie had played a very important role in movements. I fully agree. However, if we start from the structural criteria, that is, from what I described as class places, they are not productive workers. They are productive workers if they work for a private school. There is a very famous extract of Marx's Capital, the first volume, where Marx writes, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I somehow remember it. Marx writes that if we were to take an example from outside the material production, a teacher in a private school who breaks his back not only to cultivate or to form the brains of his students, but also to produce surplus value for the owner of the school, is a productive worker like all others. The fact that the capitalist has placed his money, his capital, in a teaching factory and not in a sausage factory makes a little difference or no difference. I think this is a very characteristic example that a teacher in a private school is a productive worker and a teacher in the public sector is a non-productive worker. That is, the first is working class, the second is new petty bourgeoisie. Of course, there are extreme similarities of the roles, of their way they work, what they do. And this is the basis that explains their similar stances in several conjunctures. And one of my main points is that an alliance of the working class, that is the perspective of a more humane society, and of course of overthrowing capitalism, the perspective of socialism and communism, can bring together the two classes, that is the working class and a large part, the majority of the new petty bourgeoisie.
Okay, David has a couple of questions in the chat. David, do you want to speak on those or just take them?
I'll just speak on the second one because it's more, it takes us back to the sort of pretty high social theory realm that that you started on, John, and that has to do with Marx's theory of revolution seems to assume that as capitalism develops, there will be a very radical polarization between an increasingly small and increasingly wealthy capitalist class and an increasingly large proletariat that has largely absorbed all the petty bourgeois classes of traditional society, which seem to make, be true in the earlier periods of capitalist development. But in the in the 20th century, what we've seen in advanced capitalist societies and even developing capitalist societies is this vast enlargement of state and private bureaucracies that puts more and more people draws more and more people out of the traditional working class into what you called
New petty bourgeoisie.
new petty bourgeoisie. So that seems to make such a clear polarization of society unlikely. And that kind of corresponds to our experience too in Western countries, at least. I mean, in European and American countries. So how do we reconcile this with Marx's theory?
Mm-hmm. I can imagine a twofold answer to your very interesting question. First of all, I have the feeling that if we study capitalist societies even at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, we will see a similar situation. That is not a polarization, but even in cases of polarization, the formation of two blocks, a conservative or far-right bloc at the peak of the crisis, and a revolutionary bloc. Just think capitalist Germany in 1914. That is at the beginning of the First World War, or capitalist Britain at the same time. Rosa Luxemburg said that all those who were against the war and wanted to stress the idea that the enemy is in the country and not in the other country, and proletarians of all countries unite and so on. We were so little, so few that we could be all in a telephone cell or something like that. And 4 years later, the situation was different. But if you see this situation in detail, you may well recognize practically two blocks. And there is a phase that the one block has the initiative, and at that time the revolution is possible, and then comes the other block and the counter-revolution. We had this situation in Greece during the German occupation, that is in the period 1941 to 1944. Left parties or left communist members of the Communist Party and so on have the feeling or reproduce the idea that during that period, the vast majority of the Greek people was following the National Liberation Front. The major political force behind it was the Communist Party. But suddenly, after the civil war, which was won by the bourgeois forces with the help of the British Army, the situation in the country became different, as if the big majority of the people were against the left. So I think that even in these early periods or earlier periods of capitalism, the very pessimistic idea that the development of things, the development of capitalism, the tendency of capital accumulation will lead to a vast majority of people against capitalism who is supported only by the state and a very tiny or a minority of capitalists was rather a political slogan than a scientific analysis. And I also refer, or I bring to my mind, the texts of Lenin about the state, having to do with his famous State and Revolution, where the main idea is the breaking up of the states and creating a new state organization, which would be in accordance with the interest of the working class. He speaks about special categories of the state bureaucracy, the police, the judge system and the higher authorities of this system, the heads of the army and so on, as the enemies, the foes that must be set aside or destroyed or fought against. And so he describes a whole apparatus, a strong apparatus, and not just a small minority which can be swept away very easily by the movement. Of course, you are correct to say that as capitalism developed, especially during the first decades after the Second World War, we have new state apparatuses and new processes which incorporate even the labor movement in the capitalist institutions. But this is a very big discussion. Let us remember the text by Louis Althusser, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, where he speaks about the role not only of education and mass media and the church, but even of the family as a unit that can be described, although it's a private unit, a fully private unit, as part of this, in the broader sense, capitalist state that is the framework of the ideological state apparatuses.
Okay, and there's one more question in the chat from Satiris. Could the left platform, together with Constantinopoulou, have brought down the government of Syriza by exiting Syriza and the government right after Tsipras signed the new memorandum in 15? Was there a chance then lost for the social movement of the squares?
Well, speaking with the knowledge that we have now, we see that the left platform and the party of Constantopoulou didn't succeed to surpass the 3% mean limit to enter the parliament after the second elections of September 2015. So the evolution of things showed that this was not possible. I would add that especially the left platform interpret things in a way which, to my opinion, is a little bit, let's say, nationalistic, even in quotation marks. That is, it thought that the confrontation was between the Greek people and the European Union, and that the solution was a national currency and a national policy of development or growth. What kind of growth? That is, they didn't speak or they didn't prepare the way for an anti-capitalist way out. So I don't think that they had the means or the support to make a change in that situation. On the other hand, the Communist Party, which had a much better, let's say, analysis about the crisis and the situation in Greece, didn't succeed or even didn't try to come in connection, to discuss, to be part of these people which brought to the fore Syriza, because Syriza became a party within 2 years or 3 years. Syriza became a party of 36%, being before a party of 3 to 5%, of 5%. That is, we had the collapse of the people supporting the socialists, a collapse of the Socialist Party. The people supporting the socialists left the party, and there was a whole process of seeking something new and something which should be radical and should change things. The Communist Party, although it had a better analysis, didn't try to be a part or to come in contact with these people. Maybe it did not understand that these people were losing their former identity. There were not center-left people in the ideological sense or in the political sense of the word, but they were seeking something new. On the other hand, these two fractions, let's say, of Syriza, on the one hand, Konstantopoulou, and on the other hand, the left platform under the leadership of Panagiotis Lafazanis, chose a rather national course of answering to the questions that the conjuncture was posing. They chose to fight for real development, or I don't know how to describe it, and not for social change only as a result of a new economic course with a new national currency and so on. And it was apparent very soon that this political course was not very attractive to the people, who were to a very large extent disappointed, who left their active participation in movements and so on, who to a very important percentage of more than 15% of the whole electorate did not attended the elections that followed, and who also voted for the Syriza or other parties, left parties, progressive parties, as the less evil, as a negative or a defensive vote, in order not to let the conservatives on the far right be elected again or be the major political force, and not as a representative of the movement that had been before.
Okay, I think we're close to the time of ending the event. And John, we really appreciate your presentation and your responses to the questions, and we look forward to further conversations with you. And we appreciate everyone's joining us and participating today. And there'll be further events coming up. Watch our website at marxedproject.org. And our events and classes for the fall will be announced soon there if they're not already on the website. So again, thanks very much. And
I thank you all very much. It was a great pleasure for me. My presentation is written and I can send it to you, so anyone who is interested can read it. Also the PowerPoint, which concludes the main points. Thank you very much.
I think we can send it out along with the link to the recording when it's available.
Yes.
Okay, thanks again.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.